You can sometimes get away with incorrect pumping practices or a little bit not so quite right latch in the first few months postpartum because you're likely still feeding with the milk supply training wheels on, which is great. Biology is really helping you give your new little life the best start that you can. It's a good thing. But what happens when your milk supply regulates around the 12-week mark and now it's all on you? That's what we're going to cover in this video. Just as a reminder, here at New Little Life, we serve working moms and help them pump fast and efficiently during that first year back to work. I have worked with a lot of mothers who are planning on returning to work with their breast pump. So that's kind of the lens at which we're talking about this topic today, but it applies to anyone who has a milk supply and is going to start regulating it and kind of feeling that curve at the 12-week mark. So we're going to talk about what it is, why it happens, what it means, and then really how this applies to moms who are going back to work around that same time, which can be a really tricky time to start managing your milk supply with a breast pump. If you want some help walking through that and you're a working mom, just want a step-by-step guide and come and work with me, there's a link down below to apply. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about milk supply is when I hear, especially working moms, that's who I work with, kind of say, well, I pumped a couple times on maternity leave, so it's going to be totally fine. I'm not really worried about going back to work. And especially first-time moms where they've never done this before, I always say, okay, just make sure you keep my contact information, and if anything starts going downhill, let me know as soon as you notice a problem. The truth is that your milk supply, no matter how you're managing it in the first few months, is not a great indicator of where it's going to be long term. All right, there's a lot of science here in this milk regulation topic. We're going to kind of keep it high level and really practical for you today. If you want to dive into some complex medical studies and things like that, let me know. I'll send a few your way. But we're going to try and keep it really, really practical here. Okay, let's start at the beginning of milk supply so you really have a full picture of what we're talking about, okay? Once the placenta is delivered after birth, that really triggers the next phase of lactation where you start making milk. Your hormones really kick in and just start sending all the milk. And the idea here is that your body sends you a lot of milk and then you tell it how much you need. And then together you work on this happy little dance until you figure out the exact amount that your baby needs. Okay, that's the overall goal of what is happening biologically in your body, okay? So in theory, you shouldn't need those hormones long term, which is why they die off naturally, right? Your body's just trying to say, okay, here's the milk, tell me what you need, and then I'll let you manage it from here. This is why you have a little bit of engorgement in that first week, especially because your hormones are just saying, here you go, tell me what you need. So that can happen. And that's because your milk supply in the beginning is largely hormonally driven. Supply and demand is important too, but it often takes a lot less demand to encourage the supply. So I kind of feel like this is a similar scenario to getting a toddler to eat a carrot with his dinner. It's like, please take one bite and then you can have dessert. We can go to the park and you can stay up half an hour past your bedtime, just like one bite of this carrot. Okay. Versus, for instance, my 10-year-old who I'm like, eat your carrots. You need the nutrients. It's just, it takes a lot less demand in the beginning. And, you know, you stimulate the nipples, you do a little suction and your body's like, sweet, here's the milk. And then after those hormones kind of die out, it's all supply and demand. And the stimulation that's happening needs to be more efficient and more effective. Does that make sense? So the further you get from birth, the more vital it is that you have the correct stimulation and frequent and efficient milk removal, whether you're using a baby or a pump. Your hormones can kind of mask problems that might be happening. And then once you hit this 12-week mark, now things are out in the open and you're like, why is everything falling off the train? Okay. So let's talk about when this happens. I know I've said 12 weeks a couple of times. That's really just an average. So don't marry that number. Somewhere between 8 and 16 weeks is when your hormones kind of leave and let you do your thing, supply and demand style, okay? If you were exclusively breastfeeding, you may not even notice this happening, okay? Babies are designed to react in real time and adjust to changes. So if feeding is going well, it's often smooth sailing, like you don't have to do a lot of things. There is a video I did several years ago, but it's still very relevant, on 9 things that are not low milk supply. And these are some changes that you might notice around this time that don't necessarily mean your supply is struggling. It just might mean that your supply is regulating out and finding the new normal. So I'll link that up top for you and in the description. But a couple of things we covered in that video is you might start to feel less full. You know, that heaviness that you felt in the beginning and just like, I have milk in there, that might kind of go away, even if there is milk in there. You might stop leaking as often or as randomly as you did in the beginning. Again, it doesn't mean that you're losing your milk supply. It just means that your hormones may be hitting the trail. If you're exclusively pumping, you might actually notice this because you have more direct access to measurements and tracking. So you might notice that you need to pump a little bit more, or it might be a little bit more difficult to get the milk out that you know is there. You might need to be a little bit more hands-on, things like that. This is often the time when we really start needing to dive into the specifics of pumping if they weren't quite right. You can usually get away with a just okay flange size in the beginning when milk is just flowing and coming easily. Once the hormones are gone, then it takes correct practices and use to really make sure that it's sustainable. If you've been rocking an oversupply for a little bit, you might notice that it comes down a little bit and you have to work harder to keep it up higher. Again, some people don't really notice this, especially if things are going really, really well, either with a baby or a breast pump, and you just keep going on, right? But I do hear this a lot, and I think you see it on social media a lot too, this milk regulation, so I wanted to talk about that today. So why does this happen? Really, this is biology helping you out in the beginning. It wants to make sure that you have plenty of milk for a new baby. They're growing really quickly in the beginning. So we have just adapted to push a lot of milk right at the beginning, make sure you have what you need, and then kind of dive into the supply and demand after that. This really is nature's way of helping you have a full supply, even if things aren't quite right yet. Newborns have a learning curve in how they breastfeed, right? As does the mother. So it's nice to have that little buffer. I like the word training wheels. You really have the training wheels on. Your hormones are really helping you. Any stimulation that happens, that's like, cool, here's the milk, you know? And usually when feeding is going well, babies figure out how to feed efficiently by the time this happens. Like I said, so sometimes you don't even notice. Pumping during this time is often easier too because you just stimulate the breast and sends the milk. And then when it becomes more supply and demand, it's really, really important that things are happening correctly or milk supply does not sustain. It can be easy to have things kind of hidden behind those hormones in the beginning because it's just easier. So I think a question I often get is, can you increase supply after your milk regulates? Okay, you can, but it's often harder. So if you're already past that point, don't set your sails and say this ship is gone. It's just a little trickier because you are totally in control now. The stimulation has to be correct, it has to be efficient, and it has to be frequent to be able to do that. In the beginning, it's easier because your hormones are helping you too. Does that make sense? Sometimes we need to increase the number of demand signals that we're sending to get the supply and amount to a normal amount of where we want it. The two things that often you need when you're working on increasing your milk supply, especially after your milk has already kind of evened out and regulated, are pumping more and or pumping better. I say pumping, you can exchange that for feeding at the breast too. Again, pumping is just like what I do and how I help moms, so that's on the brain, but you can take it either way. So let's dive into those. One, more frequent demand. This is probably the easiest thing to try first and even on your own. Frequent milk removal is key for milk production. We know that. It's not always a great or a sustainable solution. If you just bump up your milk expressions to 10, 12 times a day, that's a lot of pumping or feeding or whatever you're doing. I'm not sure that's sustainable. It also may be unlikely to work well if things aren't happening correctly. So if you have a baby with a tongue tie who's not good at draining the breast, just feeding them more may not fix the problem. Same with pumping. If you're not pumping correctly and efficiently, just doing it more is not the best solution. But that is one way of tackling this problem, increasing the demand by pumping or feeding more often. The other option is better stimulation and removal. So more efficiently draining the breasts. Okay, you can do this with a baby or a pump. If you're doing it with a baby, that would look like correcting the latch, eliminating bad habits that are happening, things like that. If you're using a pump, that would look like a well-fitting flange size or the appropriate type of flange that you want to use. Kind of maximizing your cycle speeds and suction levels, utilizing various pumping techniques, making sure that your schedule actually is appropriate for what you're looking for. Really kind of fine-tuning what's not happening here, getting your letdowns working really well. There's quite a few things you can do to pump correctly and maximize what you're doing. I will say it's always easier to get things going smoothly before they fall off the wagon. So find help early and often is what I recommend in your breastfeeding or pumping journey. Make sure you know where to go for help, because it's so much easier to fix problems when they're small or when they first start, rather than when they've gone so long and now you're making, drops a day. It's a lot longer road back to the top. So what does this mean for working moms? Unfortunately, milk supply regulation around 12 weeks is a very similar timeline to a common return to work for those who are on maternity leave, especially in the United States. I know it varies a little bit, but it's really unfortunate that these coincide. And this is probably why so many stories look like mine did. All right. And I'll put a video up top, probably over there, for a full story of what happened to me, which is why I even ended up coaching working moms via pumping in the first place. But I worked really hard to get breastfeeding going. And the first 2 weeks of pumping at work went okay. And then I watched my milk supply slowly go down and down and down, even though breastfeeding was still going fine on the nights and weekends. And I couldn't figure it out. I knew it was a pumping problem, but I did not know I had a good schedule. And I thought I was doing everything right. In hindsight, I definitely was not. But it was frustrating, and honestly, mine coincided right with that regulation time. So now my body is fully relying on supply and demand, and I'm splitting my milk supply between a baby and a breast pump. So I'm relying on the baby sometimes to manage it, but I'm also relying on a breast pump sometimes to manage it, and I was not pumping correctly or appropriately or adjusting when things changed throughout that whole year back to work experience. And it's hard. You may be able to get away with poor pumping practices and not notice on maternity leave when you're in a comfortable environment, pumping at home, your hormones, training wheels are still on. And if you're also nursing the baby on top of that, or mostly nursing, it can make it look even easier. So it's just a perfect storm, to be honest. So what this milk supply regulation time means for you. Should you stress about it? No, you shouldn't. Okay. So don't let this video make you panic or make you think my milk supply is going to totally die off when I hit 12 weeks. That's not what I'm going for here. It's important to be aware of, because some of these things that you might be experiencing, again, that video on what is not low milk supply will be a really good resource for you. But if you're planning to go back to work, I think this is a really important thing to be aware of, is your milk supply is going to be changing, probably similar to the time you go back and start becoming more pump dependent. And it can really cause problems, right? If you've had babies before and you've had poor experiences, this might be contributing, because some of these things are hard to identify in the early days when things are just being masked a little bit. So if things are going well, great. Don't stress about this. Don't worry about this. Biology is designed to help you out, okay? You may notice some changes in your output, but it doesn't mean that things are falling apart. If you notice that you're no longer able to pump enough milk for your baby, or you're not able to pump as easily, or things are falling apart, you definitely need to get some help. Okay? It might be a problem or it might be normal. And either way, just getting that peace of mind and knowing what's happening, how do I fix this if I want to, does it need to be fixed, is a really important step that you take. If you're breastfeeding and experiencing some of these problems, get help from an IBCLC. That's what they're trained in to do. I'm an IBCLC, but I don't do any one-on-one consults like that. I do mostly pumping support, but you should have someone local to you or online even. Get some feedback. Even in the beginning, when you think things are going well, I always recommend that you go see an IBCLC and just double check. Get some peace of mind. Things are going well, looking really good. If you're pumping and you're struggling to pump enough output in the first months, that's a sign it's not going to get easier. Okay, so you definitely need to get help if this is a problem in the early months, but also just be aware of this. And if you notice some problems after that 12-week mark, you need help and you need to reach out. So if you're a working mom and you're frequently separated from your baby, that's what we do. We do long-term coaching so we can help you through the whole experience. Again, there's an application down below for kind of how to, and we'll give you some more information on our step-by-step process there. But an IBCLC may be able to help you with pumping stuff, but there's very few that are trained in how to do that. So quite a few other videos on the channel that may help you dive into some pumping things as well. But the easiest way is just to come and get some help. I think my final thought to you here is to just be aware of this process and what's happening. And awareness sometimes can really just help mitigate any problems that we may be having. Just because your milk supply is regulating at 12 weeks doesn't necessarily mean you have low supply. But if things were not going super great in the beginning and they're still not going great, you may actually end up with low supply after this point. And it does get harder the further from birth you get, to increase your supply. Not impossible, but just harder because we don't have the training wheels of the birth hormones anymore. So don't stress about this. Let me know what other questions you have down in the comments. If we need to do a follow-up video, we can. But I hope you understand milk supply, and especially that 12-week regulation that we hear about a lot. Happy to answer any questions in the comments and reach out if you need help. Happy pumping.